This is an example of graphic demonstrating the usage of BSP tree and how it impacts the render time. I've taken a scene and which contains about 1,000,000 triangles and rendered a static scene where it doesn't move, so no motion blur is being involved here. And I've written a Perl script to render the same MI file with different BSP tree settings. So I've pretty much rendered these 400 or so BSP tree settings over a series of 3-4 weeks. To be able to graph these draw these graphics and kind of see where the time is being taken. As you can see here, the important thing to remember is that BSP size has a much less influence over rendering time than BSP depth. So as you can see, if you lower the BSP depth, it means that the actual number of triangle contained in the actual voxel is really high. So testing triangles and will take more time because each voxel contains more triangles, and that will actually slow down the rendering. So it could go up to about, let's say, nearly like 9 minutes or even 10 minutes here. So if we increase the depth, then we have what we call a sweet spot here, which is pretty much something like 30 to depth of 30 to up to 40, where you really start to have these perfect settings. Then depending on and also on the size, you can really go from, let's say, 10, 15, 20, and 25. That demonstrates that it is really the perfect values. Okay, now if I have to pick a given value from all this in this area here, where would I put it? Well, chances are that I would put the lowest BSP depth value, because I'll be, let's say for example, I'll be using less memory, because if I go here 40, let's say for example, it will require more memory to render, because BSP3 will also need to allocate more memory to have these extra levels. So I would tend to use a lower settings here, simply because if I want to dispatch this image onto a machine that has, let's say, 512 megabyte of RAM or 1 gig, then I still want my 512 megabyte of RAM to render under quite decent amount of time. So that's what I pretty much suggest to use, is the lower BSP depth value as much as possible. So as you can see, depth has a much more important impact over rendering time than size. So that's why I suggested in the previous AVIs to lock your BSP size between 10 and 25, which is roughly 15 and 20, and just play with the actual BSP depth here to find the actual sweet spot. Here's another. This is pretty much the same scene, except that I've been taking this very dense mesh and apply a rotation over one frame of 90 degrees and enabling motion blur on this scene. So as you can see here, now the shape is totally different, where as I increases the depth, the render time goes up, and that is explainable. Whenever motion blur is being used, the triangles will basically travel over several voxels. So there's more memory demanded or needed to be able to store these transient or traveling triangles. So obviously, if there's let's say a ray being casted in the scene, and say, okay, I'm going to evaluate the shutter time 0.6, then the BSP tree has to say, well, at 0.6, at shutter time 0.6, here's all the triangles that is inside my voxel. So it has to store all this information in order to speed up the render. And because those triangle travels over so many voxels, let's say you have triangle a shutter time, let's say that is 0.1, and then obviously it will travel in the actual distance, traveling distance, much less because the shutter time is much smaller. So obviously the actual triangle will travel travel less in terms of distance. So it may spawn its position through maybe 2-3 voxel. Let's say the shutter is 1, so in this case the actual triangle may go through several, like 10 or even 15 voxels in this case. So that's why the actual BSP tree tuning has to be done in the final condition. So if you tune your BSP tree while motion blur is deactivated, then obviously this is not the good thing, because if your final render is going to be motion blur, then your BSP tree should be tuned with motion blur being enabled and with the shutter being properly set, because a shutter of 0.1 and a shutter of 1 will create a different BSP tree structure. So as you can see here, let's say it's like 20 is being really high, so we're talking about, let's say, 15 minutes or so, when 26 to 28 in terms of BSP depth give you something like 300 minutes to render this. So you could see here, I'm sorry, this is 300 seconds or so. Nevertheless, it shows that actually if you really need, especially when motion blur is being enabled, you really need to find what we call the bottom of this graphic here. So if you, let's say, log this value, let's say at depth of 20, 25 or 30, even 50, I would suggest to increase the BSP size whenever motion blur is enabled, because chances are that more triangle will be stored in the voxel. So give it a little bit more breathing space will allow you to improve your rendering time. So let's say size about 50, and then what you do is you start with a much lower value. Instead of starting, let's say, at 36 or 34, in this case 36, it would have basically run out of memory. It would have been way too high, and actually the reason why this thing is cropped is simply it was actually running out of memory. So in this case, I would suggest that you may want to start at something like 20 or 24, and basically start to increase, and eventually you'll see that the actual render will lower and eventually stagnate here. So you've pretty much found the actual perfect rendering value. If you keep on increasing the depth, you'll discover that the actual rendering may start to increase again. So now you've basically selected the actual curved bottom here for the perfect BSP depth of value. The actual BSP tree tuner script does actually consider the fact that motion blur is enabled and actually tune the BSP values differently in that case. So to give you a little bit more graphics about the other BSP tree statistics that's been generated. So let's say, for example, this heavy mesh in static position. So as you can see, the average depth is actually pretty high whenever the size is low and whenever the depth is really high. The reason why is BSP size here is quite small, so it says no, I'm not allowing in the voxel to, it should only contain a maximum of 10 triangles. And because you put the actual BSP depth really high here, then you're allowing the actual average depth to go beyond, and so it will go deeper in the actual structure. So the average depth increases. This is the same graphics, except it is for the average motion blur. Because the actual triangle, the number triangle travels over space, the actual memory demand is totally different. So obviously this will generate a different graphic. So as you can see here, we've pretty much set, let's say, for example, a BSP size. This is pretty much, I'm sorry, the labels are incorrect here. So this is depth and this is size. Um, so for example, the actual average BSP depth is pretty much maxed out here. There's a reason for this, is that as you increases, because the actual voxel contains so many triangles, that it'll always really go to the actual maximum. So that's why you get these type of graphics. So expect this when motion blur is going to be enabled. This is another one that shows the average leaf size. So the average leaf size is the number of triangle, the average number of a triangle contains in a voxel. So obviously the lower this value is, better the actual rendering time is going to be. So in the perfect world, let's say we put the size small and we put the actual BSP depth high, then obviously that is going to create a very deep tree, and obviously because the tree has a lot of levels, then the average leaf size is going to be very, very low. So in the static scene here, we pretty much remember that the actual sweet spot, or the perfect rendering settings, was something like 34, 36 up to 40 and 10.5. So you could see here that the leaf size is ranging from about 20, 40 or 60 triangle per voxel. But if you do lower the depth, it means that it will go less deep in the tree. So each of the voxel will contain more triangles, and because more triangles are contained in the voxel, the average leaf size will go up. As you can see here, I'm going to switch between the static and motion blur, static, motion blur. You see that because the triangles travel so much in space during the actual motion blurring, that the actual shape of the curve here is totally different. It's a little bit steeper. So as you can see here, sending the actual BSP tree to something like 32 and 10 will lower this value. Obviously, if you lower it here, you'll see that the average leaf size is much higher than the actual static version. So it's almost kind of double. The reason is simple, is because these traveling triangles in space needs to be recorded in each voxel. So the actual number of triangle being recorded in each voxel will increase because of these moving triangles. This is the maximum number of leaf nodes. As you can see here, depending on the actual BSP depth and size, you could see that whenever the actual size is small and the depth is high, it means that I'll be creating more leaf nodes, so more voxel. And higher these leaf nodes count is, then more memory is going to be involved. So as you can see here, depth being high and size being low creates a lot of leaf nodes, and obviously increases the memory demand. For the motion blur version, you see that it's a little bit steeper. So as the actual size here, you could see now that whenever you actually increases depth here, 48, now the actual demand in terms of leaf node increases because of these moving triangles. So you could see that when motion blur is being enabled, memory demand, overall memory demand will increase because the number of leaf nodes will be much higher, much higher.